The bench was cold. Not just cold to the touch, but cold in the way that seeped through wool and skin and went looking for bone. Marlowe Whitaker pulled her coat tighter around the small body curled against her side, and she counted the street lamps along the path, because counting was something to do and doing something was better than thinking. $47. That was what was left in her wallet. She had counted it 3 times since the sun went down, as if the number might change. It had not changed. It would not change. The park at 2 in the morning was a different country. The joggers and dog walkers and lunchtime office workers had all gone home to their warm apartments, and what remained were the people who had nowhere else to be. A man slept under newspapers 2 benches away. A woman pushed a shopping cart along the path, talking softly to no one. And on a green slatted bench beneath a sodium light that buzzed like a wounded insect, a 37-year-old woman held her 6-year-old daughter and watched her breath turn to ghosts in the air. Wren was sleeping. That was the small mercy of the night. She had cried earlier just once when she had asked if they could go home, and Marlowe had not been able to answer her. And then the child had simply stopped asking. She had stopped asking a lot of things in the last 3 weeks, and Marlowe did not know if that was strength or surrender, and she was too tired to know the difference. The little girl shifted in her sleep. Her lips moved. "Mama?" Wren whispered, eyes still closed. "The lady with the white hair came again." Marlowe looked down at her daughter's face. The lamp painted Wren's cheek the color of old gold. "What lady, sweetheart?" But the child was already gone again, deep into whatever dream had her tonight. Marlowe brushed a strand of dark hair away from Wren's forehead and looked up at the sky, which was not really a sky at all. Just a grey smudge above the city where the stars used to live. She tried to remember when everything had begun to come apart. It was not one moment. It was never one moment. It was 1,000 small ones, each of them harmless on its own, until you looked back and saw that they had been arranged like dominoes by some patient and indifferent hand. 2 years ago, Calder had packed a single suitcase and stood in the doorway of the apartment they had shared for 9 years. He had not looked at Wren, who was 4 years old and watching cartoons in the living room and humming to herself. He had only looked at Marlowe, and he had said, "I cannot do this anymore." And she had asked what this was, and he had said all of it. And then he had walked out and the door had closed behind him with a small ordinary click. And that had been the end of her marriage. There had been no shouting. There had been no other woman as far as she ever knew. He had simply decided that the life they had built was too heavy for him to carry, and he had set it down. She had carried it alone. She had been good at her job at the publishing house on the 11th floor of a building in Midtown. She had been an editor for 15 years. She had a reputation for finding the bones of a manuscript and helping authors set them straight. She had kept the rent paid and ran in the small Montessori school 3 blocks away, and for a while, even after Calder, it had been possible. And then the publishing house had folded. One Friday afternoon in February, a man in a grey suit had stood at the front of the conference room and said the word bankruptcy as if it were a kind of weather. Something that simply happened. And then a woman from Human Resources had handed out envelopes. And Marlowe had walked out into the cold with a cardboard box full of red pens and a framed photo of Wren and 3 plants she would later leave on the curb because she could not carry everything. 6 months. 6 months of applications and interviews and waiting, and the slow, terrible math of a bank account draining towards zero. The savings went first, then the small inheritance from her adoptive father, who had died when she was 23. Then the jewelry sold at a pawn shop on Atlantic Avenue where the man behind the counter had not looked at her face when he took the necklace her mother had supposedly worn. Marlowe had never known her mother. She had been adopted as an infant by a kind, quiet couple in Connecticut who had told her only that her birth mother had died in childbirth and that her father had died before she was born. They had not known any more than that, and Marlowe had not pressed because they were the parents she had, and she had loved them and they had loved her. And that had been enough. Until it was not enough. Until she was sitting on a park bench in Brooklyn at 2 in the morning with her daughter and $47 in her wallet and 3 weeks of having nowhere to put her body down. The shelter had been the first stop after the eviction. 3 nights in a cot in a room with 14 other women, some of them kind, some of them not. And Wren had clung to her like a small drowning animal. Then the buses when the shelter could not take them any longer. Then the all-night diners where you could nurse 1 cup of coffee for 3 hours if you tipped well at the end. Then the libraries during the day, and now the bench. Wren stirred again. "Mama, I'm here, baby. Are we going to be okay?" Marlowe closed her eyes. She did not have a good answer for that question. She had never had a good answer for that question. But she had learned in the way that all mothers learn, that the truth and the answer are not always the same thing. "Yes, sweetheart, we're going to be okay." Wren nodded against her shoulder, satisfied with the lie or the promise, whichever it was. And then she said very quietly, "The lady with the white hair said so too." A train rumbled somewhere in the distance. The man under the newspapers coughed in his sleep. Marlowe looked at her daughter's small sleeping face, and she felt the cold reaching through her coat for her ribs, and she did not say anything at all. The library opened at 9. Marlowe knew this because she had spent 6 of the last 15 days inside it, sitting at a long table near the radiator, reading children's books to Wren in a whisper, while the librarian pretended not to notice that they were not really there to read. The walk from the park took 20 minutes. Wren held her hand and did not complain, even though the wind off the East River was sharp enough to cut. They passed a bakery, and the smell of bread came out through the door like a small, terrible kindness. And Marlowe pulled her daughter past it without slowing down. Inside the library, the air was warm. Wren went straight to the children's section and pulled a book about a rabbit off the shelf. The same book she had read every day for a week. And she carried it back to their table and opened it without speaking. Marlowe sat down across from her and plugged her phone into the outlet by the radiator because the battery was at 6% and she could not afford to lose it. The screen flickered to life. There was a missed call from a number she did not recognize. There was no voicemail. There was no message. She almost did not call back. She had stopped calling back numbers she did not recognize because they were always collection agencies or scams, or the kind of bad news that comes wrapped in a stranger's voice. But something stopped her thumb above the screen, a small, unaccountable instinct. The phone rang twice on the other end before a woman answered. "Thackeray and Associates Attorneys at Law. How may I direct your call?" Marlowe was silent for a moment. She did not know any attorneys. "I'm sorry, I had a missed call from this number. May I have your name, please?" "Marlowe Whitaker." There was a pause. Then the woman said, "One moment, Mrs. Whitaker. Mr. Thackeray has been trying to reach you." The line went quiet. Marlowe looked across the table at Wren, who was tracing the picture of the rabbit with one small finger. The little girl looked up and met her mother's eyes, and for a moment something in her face was older than 6. A man's voice came on the line. Old, careful kind in the way that very expensive lawyers sometimes are. "Mrs. Whitaker, my name is Lawrence Thackeray. I represent the estate of the late Cordelia Ravenwood. Am I correct in understanding that you are the daughter of Genevieve Ravenwood, born November of 1988 in Ashford Hollow, Vermont?" Marlowe could not answer for a moment. She had not heard her mother's name spoken aloud since her adoptive father's funeral, and even then it had only been a hesitant mention, a footnote in a eulogy. Genevieve. The name belonged to a stranger. "Yes," she said finally. "I think so. My birth mother. I was adopted." "I understand. Mrs. Whitaker, I apologize for the delay in reaching you. Your great-aunt Cordelia Ravenwood passed away 3 months ago. As her only living blood relative, you are the sole beneficiary of her estate. This includes Ravenwood Manor and its surrounding grounds in Vermont. I have been attempting to locate you since her death." Marlowe did not say anything. She looked at Wren, who had stopped tracing the rabbit and was now watching her with an expression of complete and ancient calm. "Mrs. Whitaker, are you still there?" "Yes, I'm here." "Would it be possible for you to travel to Vermont? There are documents to sign, and the house, of course, is yours whenever you would like to take possession of it." Marlowe closed her eyes. She thought of the $47 in her wallet. She thought of the bench. She thought of the bakery she had walked her daughter past that morning. "Yes," she said, "I can come." She bought 2 tickets on the 4:30 bus out of Port Authority. They cost $38. She had $9 left when she sat down with Wren in the cracked vinyl seat near the back, and she spent 4 of them on a pack of crackers and a small carton of milk from the kiosk near the gate. And she watched her daughter eat them as the bus pulled out of the terminal and turned north. It was an 8-hour ride. Wren slept for most of it. Marlowe did not sleep. She watched the lights of cities pass and dwindle, and then the dark of small towns, and then the deeper dark of forests, and somewhere around the Massachusetts border, the snow began. Vermont met them with white. Not the hard gray plowed-over white of the city, but a clean, deep country white that made the whole landscape look like it had just been born. The bus let them off in Ashford Hollow at 12 minutes past midnight, in front of a brick station that had been closed for the night. There was a single taxi waiting at the curb. The driver was an old man in a hunter's cap, who did not seem surprised to see a woman and a small child stepping off a bus in the middle of the night. Marlowe gave him the address from the lawyer's letter. The old man looked at her for a long moment in the rearview mirror. Ravenwood Manor. Yes. He did not say anything else for a while. He started the meter and pulled away from the curb. The town was small and quiet under the snow, and the few houses they passed had their lights off, and the road climbed gradually into hills that rose like the backs of sleeping animals. After about 10 minutes, he spoke again. Haven't taken anyone up to that house in 20 years. Marlowe did not know how to answer that. She held Wren a little tighter against her side. The driver did not seem to expect an answer. He just drove. The road narrowed. The trees on either side leaned in close enough to brush the roof. And then around a long curve, the headlights swept across a wrought iron gate, and beyond the gate at the end of a long gravel drive, a house began to take shape against the snow. Wren sat up. She had not made a sound for the entire ride, but now she was wide awake, her face pressed to the window, her small hand flat against the cold glass. "Mama?" she said. Her voice was hushed, but it was not afraid. "I saw this house in a dream." Marlowe looked at her daughter. "Sweetheart, you've never been to Vermont." "I know," Wren said, "but the lady with the white hair showed it to me. She said we were going to live here. She said it was already ours." The taxi rolled to a stop in front of the gate. The driver turned in his seat. He looked at Wren for a long moment, and then he looked at Marlowe. And something in his face had changed. It had softened or sharpened. Marlowe could not tell which. "That'll be $22, ma'am." She gave him her last bills and the small handful of coins from the bottom of her bag. And she felt the weight of having nothing left, and the strange weightlessness of having arrived somewhere. And she opened the door and lifted her daughter down into the snow. The taxi pulled away. The red of its taillights vanished around the curve. And then there was only the silence of the country and the breathing of the trees and the long dark shape of the house at the end of the drive. The gate was not locked. It opened with a sound like an old man clearing his throat, and the rust came off on Marlowe's palm. She took Wren's hand, and together they walked up the long drive. The house was enormous. She had not been prepared for that, even with the photograph the lawyer had emailed her. It was 3 stories of dark Victorian stone and gabled roofs with a wraparound porch and tall, narrow windows that caught the moonlight like sheets of black ice. The front steps were swept clean of snow, which struck her as strange. She had been told no one had lived here for years. She climbed the steps with Wren beside her and stood in front of the massive oak door. There was a brass ring for a knocker. There was a name engraved into a plate above it: Ravenwood. She took the 3 iron keys from her pocket. The lawyer had given them to her by overnight courier 2 days before, when she had still been at the shelter. The largest one turned in the lock with a heavy complaining groan, and the door swung inward into a darkness that smelled of old wood and old wax, and something else, something faint, something almost like roses. Marlowe felt for a light switch. She did not expect it to work, but when her fingers found it, the chandelier above the foyer flickered once and then bloomed into a soft golden light, and the room beneath it was suddenly real. Sheets covered most of the furniture. Dust lay in pale drifts in the corners. A grand staircase rose to the 2nd floor, its banister polished smooth by 100 years of hands. The marble floor was cracked but elegant. A portrait of a man in a high-collared coat watched them from the wall above the staircase. Wren let go of her hand. "Sweetheart, wait." But the little girl was already moving. She crossed the foyer with the steady, unhurried gait of someone who knew exactly where she was going. She did not look at the portrait. She did not look at the chandelier. She walked to the foot of the grand staircase and started up. "Wren, please, we don't know what's up there." The child kept climbing. Marlowe hurried after her, the key still in her hand. At the top of the staircase, Wren turned right without hesitation. She walked down a long hallway lined with closed doors. She stopped at the 4th door on the left. She put her hand on the brass knob. "This is my room, Mama." She opened the door. The room inside was a child's room. Wallpaper printed with small blue flowers, a four-poster bed with a quilt that looked old but clean, a little writing desk under the window, and on a shelf above the desk a porcelain doll in a blue dress with painted dark hair and dark eyes exactly the size of a 6-year-old girl's friend. Wren walked in and stood in the center of the room. She did not touch the doll. She did not climb onto the bed. She simply turned in a slow circle, taking in every wall, every corner, with the expression of someone who had been away on a long trip and had just come home. Marlowe stood in the doorway and did not breathe. A sound came from downstairs. It was a small sound, the sound of a tea kettle somewhere in the back of the house beginning to sing. Marlowe turned. She had not lit the stove. She had not been anywhere near a kitchen. She gathered Wren behind her with one arm and she picked up a heavy brass candlestick from the hall table, and she went slowly back down the staircase with her daughter on her hip and the candlestick raised. The kitchen was at the back of the house, down a long hallway hung with old oil paintings. The light was on. A woman stood at the stove with her back to Marlowe. She was tall and thin with iron gray hair pinned at the nape of her neck, and she was wearing a dark wool dress and a clean white apron, and she was pouring boiling water into a porcelain teapot. "You'll want chamomile, I expect," the woman said without turning around. "The child must be exhausted." Marlowe did not lower the candlestick. "Who are you?" The woman set the kettle down. She turned. Her face was lined and proud, and her eyes were the color of slate. She looked at Marlowe for a long moment, and her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes moved. "My name is Adelaide Holloway. I have been the housekeeper at Ravenwood Manor for 40 years. The lawyer didn't mention a housekeeper. Mr. Thackeray rarely mentions what does not directly concern legal matters. Adelaide's gaze dropped to Wren, who was still on Marlowe's hip, peeking out from behind her mother's shoulder. "Miss Cordelia made arrangements for me to continue caring for the house after her passing, and she made arrangements for the child. The child, the room upstairs, the one she chose. Miss Cordelia prepared it 6 months ago." Marlowe's grip on the candlestick loosened. She couldn't have known. "No," Adelaide said. "I suppose she couldn't have." There was a small movement against Marlowe's side. Wren had slipped down. She walked across the kitchen floor on bare feet because she had taken off her shoes somewhere upstairs, and Marlowe had not even noticed. She walked straight to Adelaide Holloway. She stopped in front of her. She looked up. And then she did something Marlowe could not have prepared for. She wrapped her arms around the old woman's waist and she held on, and she said into the apron, "I missed you." Adelaide Holloway, who had not by her own account shown a flicker of feeling in 40 years of service, made a small sound that was not quite a word. Her hand came down on the top of Wren's head. Her fingers, long and thin and steady, smoothed the child's hair back from her forehead. And then slowly 2 tears slid down her face and disappeared into the collar of her dark dress. She looked up at Marlowe over the top of the child's head. "Miss Cordelia said you would come tonight," she said. Her voice was as even as if she were reporting the weather. "She told me to put the kettle on at midnight. She told me the little one would know the way." Marlowe lowered the candlestick. She set it on the kitchen table. Her knees felt strange and far away. She sat down in a chair at the table because she did not trust them to keep her up any longer. The tea kettle's steam rose between them like a small white ghost. "How?" Marlowe said. And she could not finish the sentence because she did not know what she was asking. Adelaide poured a cup of chamomile and set it in front of her. She poured a smaller cup for Wren with a great deal of milk and a spoon of honey. She did not pour one for herself. "There are things in this house that cannot be explained in one night," she said. "There are things that took Miss Cordelia 37 years to put in order. Drink your tea. Tomorrow morning I will make eggs. The child will have her room. You will have the master bedroom which has been aired and made up, and we will begin slowly to tell you who you are." Marlowe lifted the cup. Her hands were shaking. The tea was hot and good. She watched her daughter drink the milky sweet tea with her eyes closed, the way a small animal drinks at the edge of a safe pond. For the first time in 3 weeks, Marlowe felt the cold begin to leave her ribs. She slept that night in a bed with sheets that smelled of lavender, in a room with a window that looked out over a snowy garden, and the dark shapes of oak trees older than the house itself. Wren slept down the hall in the room she had claimed, with the porcelain doll watching from the shelf. Adelaide Holloway had gone home somewhere into the snow with the promise of returning in the morning. The next day was the brightest Marlowe had seen in months. The snow had stopped in the night, and the sun came up over Vermont and turned everything to glass. She walked through rooms she had not seen the night before. A library with shelves to the ceiling, a music room with a covered piano, a sitting room with a fireplace large enough to stand inside. The house was old and proud and tired, and it seemed somehow to be watching her back. Wren ate eggs at the kitchen table with the kind of focus only a hungry child can give to food. Adelaide stood at the stove and did not speak unless spoken to. After breakfast, she said she had errands in town, and she would return in the afternoon, and she left a list of what was in the pantry and the address of the doctor in town in case the child needed anything. When she was gone, the house was quiet. Wren slipped down from her chair. She took Marlowe's hand. She led her mother through the kitchen, down the hallway, back into the grand foyer. She stopped in front of a section of wall under the staircase. The wallpaper there was an intricate pattern of small dark flowers on a faded green ground, exactly the same as the rest of the foyer, except that it was not exactly the same. Marlowe had not noticed it the night before. She would not have noticed it now if her daughter had not stopped in front of it and put her small hand flat against it. "Mama," Wren said, "there's a door here." Marlowe knelt down beside her. She ran her fingers along the wall. The wallpaper was seamless, or seemed to be, except when she pressed gently with the heel of her hand there, in a place where there should only have been plaster and lath the wall gave. A small panel clicked inward. Behind it, set low to the floor, was a door. It was not much taller than Wren herself. It had a brass handle worn smooth by use. It was the kind of door a house keeps for itself. Marlowe pulled it open. A small room lay beyond, a private study by the look of it. Heavy curtains over a narrow window, a writing desk under a green-shaded lamp, bookshelves rising to a low ceiling, a wing-back chair angled toward the desk as if its occupant had only just stepped out, and on the desk, in a silver frame, a photograph. Marlowe stood up slowly. She walked into the small room. She picked up the frame. The photograph was black and white. It showed a young woman in a sleeveless dress, her hair styled in a way that placed her firmly in the middle of the 1980s. She was standing in front of a stone wall, laughing with her head tilted slightly to the right. She had Marlowe's face. Not similar, not approximate. The same face exactly down to the small asymmetry of the smile and the habit of tilting the head when photographed. Marlowe turned the frame over. On the back, in faded ink in a hand she did not know but somehow recognized, was written, "Genevieve. Summer 1985. Marlowe sat down very slowly in the wingback chair. The photograph was in her hands. Her daughter came and stood beside her and put one small hand on her mother's knee. "That's your mommy's mommy," Wren said quietly. "She's pretty. She has your eyes." Marlowe had never told her daughter anything about her birth mother. She had never said the name Genevieve. She had not known the name Genevieve until a lawyer had spoken it to her in a library 2 days before. She looked at her daughter. Wren was looking at the photograph with a small, sad, knowing expression that did not belong on a 6-year-old's face. "Sweetheart?" Marlowe said. Her voice was very careful. "How did you know that?" Wren shrugged the way children do when an answer is too obvious to bother with. "The lady with the white hair told me," she said. "She showed me a picture of her when I was sleeping. She said her name was Genevieve. She said she missed you very much." Marlowe held the photograph in her lap. The sun came through a crack in the curtains and laid a single bar of gold across the dusty floor of the small room. Somewhere in the house, a clock she had not yet seen began to chime slow and deep, marking the noon hour. She did not yet know about the iron key in the family Bible. She did not yet know about the man named Royce Blackwood, who would arrive in a black SUV in 3 days' time. She did not yet know about her grandfather Edmund, whose boat had been found empty on a lake in 1988 and whose body had never been recovered. She did not yet know about the doctor in town who had delivered her and who carried in his quiet old age a suspicion that he had never been able to prove. She did not yet know any of it. She only knew that she was sitting in a small hidden room in a house that had not been her house yesterday, holding a photograph of a woman who had her face, and that her daughter, who was 6 years old and had never been to Vermont, was speaking the name of the dead. Outside, a wind moved through the oaks. The house creaked the way old houses do, settling on its bones. And somewhere upstairs in a hallway, Marlowe had not yet walked a door that had been closed for 37 years, began very softly to open. The door upstairs did not stay open long. By the time Marlowe climbed the staircase with the photograph still in one hand and Wren's small fingers wrapped around the other, every door on the second floor was closed, and the hallway was silent. And the only sound in the house was the slow, deep ticking of a grandfather clock she had not yet located. She did not go looking for whatever room had opened itself. She told herself, standing at the top of the stairs with her daughter, that she had imagined the soft click of a latch, that old houses settled, that tired women heard things. She told herself this, and she did not believe it. But the photograph in her hand was real, and the child holding her other hand was real, and the cold of the morning had not yet entirely left her bones. So she walked back down the stairs and she set the photograph on the kitchen table, and she made Wren a piece of toast with butter, and she tried to think about what she would do next. Adelaide Holloway came back at 3. She let herself in with a key of her own, carrying 2 paper grocery bags and a basket covered with a checkered cloth, and she did not seem surprised to find Marlowe sitting at the kitchen table with a half-finished cup of cold tea in front of her and the photograph between her hands. "You found the study," Adelaide said. It was not a question. "My daughter found it." Adelaide set the bags down on the counter. She glanced at Wren, who was on the floor in front of the kitchen fireplace, building a small castle out of the logs Marlowe had stacked there that morning. The child was humming to herself. "She would," Adelaide said. "Miss Cordelia said the little one would know what to look for." "How did Cordelia know I had a daughter?" Adelaide began to unpack the bags: bread, eggs, a pound of butter wrapped in white paper, a small jar of honey with the comb still inside. She did not answer the question for a long moment. When she did, her voice was even and almost gentle. Miss Cordelia knew a great many things she had no business knowing. She would say it was instinct. "I came to believe after 40 years that the women of this family see further than most. Your mother had it. Your grandfather's sister had it. And the child on the floor has it in greater measure than any of them." Marlowe looked at her daughter, who was now arranging the logs into the shape of a small castle gate. Wren did not look up. "I need to understand who my mother was," Marlowe said quietly. Adelaide set down a loaf of bread. She wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at Marlowe for a long time, and then she nodded the way a person nods when a thing they have been waiting for has finally arrived. "Then you will need to go into town tomorrow," she said. "There are people there who knew her. There is a diner with a waitress named Maribel who has a long memory, and there is a man at the Historical Society who has been waiting his whole life for someone like you to walk through his door." The town of Ashford Hollow was small in the way that only New England towns can be small. A single main street of brick storefronts, a white steepled church at one end and a stone library at the other, a diner with a hand-painted sign reading Maribel's, and a hardware store, and a barber shop with a striped pole that still turned. Marlowe drove down from the manor in an old grey Volvo wagon that Adelaide had pulled the dust cover off of that morning, after producing a set of keys from a drawer in the kitchen. The car was 30 years old. The engine had complained for a full minute before it caught, but it ran and it had heat, and Wren had sat in the passenger seat in her booster cushion, with her face pressed against the window the entire way down, watching the snow on the hills and saying nothing at all. The bell above the door of Maribel's diner rang when they walked in. Every head in the diner turned. Marlowe felt the look that small towns reserve for strangers, the long, careful, evaluating look. She set her hand on Wren's shoulder and walked to a booth by the window. A waitress in her 60s came over with 2 laminated menus. She had a kind, weathered face and a name tag that read Maribel in faded letters. She looked at Marlowe. She looked at Wren. And then she looked at Marlowe again, harder this time, and her face changed. "My word," she said softly. "You're the spitting image." Marlowe set the menu down. "Of who?" Maribel sat down on the bench across from them, uninvited, but not unwelcome. She put her order pad on the table and her hands flat beside it. Her eyes were wet at the corners, though she was smiling. "Your name's Whitaker, isn't it? You're staying up at Ravenwood Manor." "Yes." "Honey, your mother used to sit in this exact booth, right where you're sitting now. She used to come in on Saturday mornings with a man named Tobias Whitaker, and they used to share a stack of blueberry pancakes. and they used to look at each other like the rest of the world didn't exist. She shook her head slowly. Genevieve Ravenwood. Lord, I haven't said that name out loud in 37 years. Marlowe could not speak for a moment. Wren was watching the waitress with the steady, patient attention of a child listening to a story she already half knew. You knew my parents, Marlowe said. Honey, this town knew your parents, knew them and loved most of them, and was scared half to death of one of them. Maribel's smile faded a little. Your mother was the prettiest girl in 3 counties. Your father worked at the old Blackwood lumber mill, and he was the kindest man you ever met. And your grandfather, Edmund Ravenwood, would have walked through fire for his daughter until she fell in love with a mill worker. Then he tried to walk through her instead. What happened? Maribel glanced over her shoulder at the counter, where an old man in a flannel shirt was very pointedly not looking at them. She lowered her voice. Your folks ran off. Eloped down to Pittsburgh, I think it was somewhere your grandfather couldn't reach them. Your daddy died in a logging accident when your mother was 7 months along. She came back home to have you, came back to her Aunt Cordelia because old Edmund wouldn't have her in his house. And then, Maribel swallowed. She looked at Wren and her voice dropped further. And then she died, honey, bringing you into the world. Marlowe put her hand over her mouth. Maribel reached across the table and laid her hand over Marlowe's other hand. Her palm was warm and rough from 40 years of carrying plates. And there's something else you need to know, Maribel said. Her eyes flicked again toward the counter. There are still people in this town who get nervous when the name Ravenwood comes up. There are still people who just as soon that house came down. So you be careful, honey, especially with that little one. Wren had gone very still. She was looking at Maribel with her dark, unblinking eyes. The lady with the white hair already told us, Wren said quietly. Maribel went pale. She looked at the child for a long moment, and then slowly she reached out and tucked a strand of dark hair behind Wren's ear with a hand that was no longer entirely steady. You take real good care of your mama, little one, she said. You hear me, you take real good care of her. That night, after Wren had eaten a small dinner of chicken soup and gone to bed in her room, with the porcelain doll watching from the shelf, Marlowe sat in the kitchen with Adelaide Holloway and a pot of strong black tea between them. There's a Bible, Marlowe said. Cordelia's letter mentioned one. In the upstairs library. Adelaide nodded. Behind the 3rd panel of the bookcase nearest the window. Miss Cordelia kept it hidden because Edmund's people used to come looking for it after he disappeared. They never found it. They didn't know it existed. Marlowe went upstairs. She found the library. She found the panel. The Bible was bound in red leather, cracked and soft with age. And when she carried it down to the kitchen table and opened the cover, a small brass key fell out and landed with a quiet ring on the wood. The family register filled the first pages, names and dates going back to the 1850s. She traced them down with her finger. Edmund Ravenwood, born 1940, married 1965, 1 child. Genevieve, born 1966, married Tobias Whitaker, April 15, 1987. The word unauthorized had been written in beside the marriage in a sharp, angry hand, and then below it in a different hand altogether. An elegant and careful script was written. Marlowe Genevieve Whitaker, born November 2nd, 1988. Daughter of Genevieve Ravenwood Whitaker and Tobias Whitaker. And below that, in the same careful hand, Edmund Ravenwood. Disappeared October the 11th, 1988. Body never recovered. A yellowed newspaper clipping had been folded between the pages. Marlowe unfolded it with shaking fingers. The headline was small, but the photograph beneath it was clear. A gray-haired man with a stern, handsome face stood beside another man in front of a sawmill. The caption read, Edmund Ravenwood left with longtime business partner Garrison Blackwood. Date of photograph 1986. The article said that Mr. Ravenwood's boat had been found drifting empty on Eagle Lake. That a search was underway. That Mr. Blackwood, his partner in Ravenwood Industries, would oversee operations during the investigation. Marlowe read it twice. The second time, her hand was trembling. Adelaide. Who is Garrison Blackwood? Adelaide poured another cup of tea. She did not look at Marlowe when she answered. He was your grandfather's partner for 30 years. He died 10 years ago in his bed, an old man with all the wealth of the Ravenwood family safely in his pocket. His son Royce runs the development company now. and he has wanted this house for a very long time. The black SUV came up the drive on a Tuesday afternoon 3 days later. Marlowe was at the kitchen window when she saw it. Wren was on the floor with a coloring book Adelaide had brought from town. The SUV stopped in front of the porch, and a man in a dark grey suit stepped out, and even from a distance Marlowe could tell that the suit had been measured to him by someone who charged by the inch. The doorbell rang. It was an old-fashioned bell, but it still worked. Marlowe walked to the door. She did not open it right away. She looked through the small leaded window beside it. The man on the porch was in his middle 40s, expensively groomed with silver beginning to show at his temples. He had a leather portfolio under one arm and a practiced friendly smile on his face. She opened the door. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said warmly before she had spoken. "What a pleasure. My name is Royce Blackwood. I run Blackwood Development. I wonder if I might have just a few minutes of your time." "How do you know my name?" His smile did not change. "Ashford Hollow is a small town. Word travels." She did not invite him inside. She stood in the doorway. She did not move. "My father knew your great-aunt," he said, "and your grandfather, for that matter. Our families have a long history. I wanted to come and welcome you to Vermont personally. And if I may be candid, I wanted to discuss an opportunity that might be of significant benefit to you." He opened the portfolio. The first page was an architectural rendering. The manor transformed. A golf course where the oak woods now stood. Condominiums where the meadow ran down to the lake. A spa pavilion where the rose garden had been. "We've had our eye on this property for some time," Royce said. "Your great-aunt was regrettably not interested. But circumstances have changed. You have a child to think of. I understand you've recently faced some difficult times. A house this size, this old, it's a tremendous burden. We are prepared to make you a very generous offer." He named a number. The number was large. The number was in fact the kind of number that could erase a park bench in Brooklyn and 3 weeks of all-night diners and the small terrible math of $47. Marlowe felt the pull of it for one long moment, and then Royce Blackwood made a mistake. He bent at the waist. He smiled down at Wren, who had come to stand quietly behind her mother's leg, looking up at him with steady dark eyes. "And what's your name, little one?" he said warmly. "Wren, isn't it? How old are you, sweetheart?" "6. Marlowe went very still. She had not said her daughter's name. She had not said her daughter's age. She had not, in the 3 minutes since opening her front door, mentioned anything about the child at her side. Wren looked up at the man for a long moment. Her small face was completely calm. Then she stepped back, took her mother's hand, and said clearly without lowering her voice, "Mama, I don't like this man." Royce Blackwood straightened. His smile did not move. But something in his eyes did. A small flicker quickly controlled. He held out a heavy embossed business card. "My personal number is on the back," he said. "Take your time. But I should mention property values in this area can be volatile. It would be unwise to delay too long." He walked back to his SUV. He did not look back. When he was gone, Marlowe closed the door, and she locked it. And she sat down on the floor of the foyer with her daughter in her lap. And she did not move for a long time. The Historical Society sat on Elm Street in a Victorian house with a fresh coat of paint and a small brass plaque by the door. Marlowe pushed the door open with one hand and led Wren in with the other. A bell jingled overhead. The man at the desk looked up. He was perhaps 55 with a neatly trimmed grey beard and reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead. He was wearing a flannel shirt and a wool cardigan, and there was a wedding band on his left hand that had clearly not been removed in many years, though Marlowe would learn later his wife had been dead for 7. "Help you," he said, and then he saw her face and he stopped. "My name is Marlowe Whitaker." He stood up slowly. He took the glasses off his head and set them down on the desk as though they had become very heavy. He looked at her and then at the child beside her, and his eyes filled, and he did not seem at all embarrassed about it. "My name is Silas Ashford," he said. His voice was rough. "I have been waiting to meet you for a long time." He showed her into the back room of the society where the family archives were kept. He pulled out a long drawer marked Ravenwood. He spread blueprints and photographs across a wide oak table. And he sat Wren down at a little side table with a stack of coloring books and a box of crayons. And the child accepted the crayons gravely, as if she had been expecting them. "Your grandfather," Silas said quietly. was the most decent man I ever knew. My own grandfather worked at the Ravenwood lumber mill for 40 years. Edmund Ravenwood paid him a fair wage, treated him like a man, and gave my father the loan that put me through graduate school after Edmund himself was already presumed dead. Cordelia honored every promise her brother ever made. She honored the promises he could no longer keep. He laid out the original blueprints of the manor. He showed her where the rooms had been changed. He showed her a wing of the basement that appeared on the 1897 plans and was simply gone from the 1927 renovation. They didn't tear it out, he said. They sealed it off. Why? Silas looked at her for a long moment. Because your grandfather hid something there, Mrs. Whitaker, and the people who did not want it found made very sure it stayed hidden. That night, the kitchen window broke. It was past midnight. Marlowe woke to the sound of glass and the smell of something sharper than glass. She sat up in bed. She listened. She heard nothing else. She got up and she walked to the door of her bedroom in her nightgown, and she opened it, and the smell was stronger in the hallway. Sweeter, sicker, gas. She ran. She ran down the hallway to Wren's room, and she pushed the door open, and she found her daughter sitting straight up in the four-poster bed, her dark eyes wide and entirely awake. "Mama," Wren said. Her voice was small and clear. "The lady with the white hair says fire. She says we have to go right now." Marlowe lifted her daughter out of the bed. She carried her down the hall and down the staircase and through the foyer and out the front door into the snow in her bare feet. In her nightgown, with no coat and no shoes, and no thought in her head except the weight of her child against her chest. She had just cleared the porch when something inside the house made a sound. A small, soft electrical sound. A breaker tripping. A spark jumping. She did not see the flame. She did not need to. She felt the warmth of it on her back as she ran across the snowy lawn with her daughter. And she felt the cold of the snow on her bare feet. And she felt her own heart pounding in her chest, like something trying to get out. And somewhere in the distance, very far away, she heard the wail of a siren. The fire did not take the house. The breaker had caught at the wrong angle. The spark had found nothing to feed on. By the time the volunteer fire department arrived, Marlowe was standing in the driveway with Wren wrapped in a blanket the chief had thrown around her shoulders, and the house was still standing dark and patient and old against the snow. The sheriff arrived 20 minutes later. He was a man in his middle 60s, broad-shouldered and quiet, with white hair under a brown felt hat, and the kind of weather-beaten face that comes from 40 winters of doing a hard job in a hard place. He climbed out of his cruiser and walked across the snow to her, and he did not say anything for a long time. He just looked at her. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said finally. "My name is Beauregard Hendricks. People around here call me Beau. I'm the sheriff of this county, and I have been for 31 years. He took off his hat. He held it against his chest. "I knew your grandfather," he said. "Edmund Ravenwood was my best friend from the time I was 8 years old until the night his boat washed up empty on Eagle Lake. I have been waiting 37 years for someone to tell me what really happened to him. I have been waiting 37 years for the chance to do right by him." His voice did not break, but it went very quiet. "Garrison Blackwood killed my best friend, Mrs. Whitaker. I could never prove it, but I knew it the day they pulled that empty boat out of the lake, and I have known it every day since. And now his son has come for your daughter." He put his hat back on. "That is not going to happen on my watch." 2 days later, Silas Ashford came to the manor with a flashlight and a hammer, and the blueprints from the Historical Society rolled under one arm. They went down into the basement. They walked along the stone wall of the east wing. Silas tapped, listened, tapped again. He frowned. He compared the wall to the blueprint. He shook his head. And then from the bottom of the basement stairs, a small voice said, "Mama, it's not in the wall, it's in the ceiling." Wren walked past them both. She walked to a place in the ceiling where a brass ring no bigger than a fingertip was almost hidden behind a wooden joist. She pointed. Silas pulled the ring. A narrow trapdoor swung down. The space above the basement between the floors was barely tall enough to crawl through, but it was a passage, and at its end was another trapdoor. And beneath that trapdoor was a room that had not been opened in 37 years. Edmund Ravenwood's private office. A heavy oak desk, filing cabinets along one wall, a safe behind a painting of the manor in summer. The air was still and dry and smelled of dust and pipe tobacco, and the faint trace of a man who had once worked there 57 autumns ago and had not been seen since. Silas examined the painting. There were small numbers worked into the brushstrokes of the sky. He read them aloud. Marlowe turned the dial. The safe clicked open. Inside was a single document. She unfolded it carefully. It was the last will and testament of Edmund Ravenwood, dated October the 4th, 1988, exactly 1 week before he disappeared. Cordelia Ravenwood had signed as witness. It left everything, every share and every acre to Genevieve Ravenwood, with Cordelia as executor. And on the second page, underlined twice in heavy ink, was a single clause. No mineral or resource extraction shall be permitted on the main estate property or its surrounding lands for a period of 100 years following the date of my death. Silas let out a breath like a man who had been holding it for a year. "Marlowe," he said quietly, "do you know what this means?" She did not yet completely, but she was beginning to. She found the journal in a hidden compartment of the desk drawer. The last entry was dated October the 10th, 1988, 1 day before her grandfather had stepped onto a boat and vanished. His handwriting was tight and angry and afraid. "Garrison threatened Genevieve today," the entry read. "Said accidents happen to young women who walk alone. I have never seen such cold calculation in a man's eyes. I have updated my will with Cordelia as witness. I have moved the geological surveys to the boathouse safe. If anything happens to me, she will know what to do. Tomorrow, I will confront him with what I have found in the books. The diverted funds, the secret purchases, the mineral rights he thinks I do not know about. It ends now, one way or another." Marlowe closed the journal. She closed it slowly. She held it against her chest. Her grandfather, a man she had never met, a man whose face she had only seen in a yellowed newspaper photograph, had stepped onto a boat 57 autumns ago to confront a murderer, and he had not come home. But he had left her this. The next afternoon, an old man knocked on the front door of the manor. He was small and bent, with silver hair and a black wool coat and a wooden cane. He took off his hat when she opened the door, and he held it in both hands the way men of his generation did. "Mrs. Whitaker, my name is Alistair Pembroke. I am 80 years old. I was the only doctor in this county for 42 years, and I retired in 2012. I am the man who delivered you on the 2nd of November, 1988. She let him in. She made him tea. He sat in the parlor with the cup balanced on his knee, and he looked at her for a long moment, and then he set the cup down. "There is something I have carried for 37 years, sir," he said, "and I think it is time I gave it to you." He looked her in the eye. "Your mother did not die of natural childbirth complications, Mrs. Whitaker. Your mother was poisoned. The nurse on duty that night was a woman who had been placed in our hospital 2 weeks before by Garrison Blackwood. I could not prove it then. The county coroner was in Blackwood's pocket, and I was a young doctor with a young family, and I was afraid. Cordelia Ravenwood knew. She knew the moment your mother began to bleed. She held my hand in the hallway outside the delivery room, and she said to me very calmly, 'We will outlive them, Alistair. We will outlive them all, and the child will come home one day, and there will be justice.'" He paused. His hand was shaking on the rim of the cup. "She waited 37 years, he said, "and now you are here." Marlowe could not speak. She felt her daughter come and lean against her side. She felt Wren's small hand take her hand. "Mama," Wren whispered, "my grandma says she loved you so much. She says she never wanted to leave you." The phone in the kitchen rang. It was Sheriff Beauregard Hendricks. His voice was quick and low. "Mrs. Whitaker, one of my deputies just spotted Royce Blackwood at the gas station outside town. He's not alone. There are 2 men with him I do not recognize, and I do not like the look of them. I think he's coming for the child. I want you out of that house tonight, or I want every able-bodied man in this town up at that door before sundown. Your choice." Marlowe looked down at her daughter. Wren looked up at her with the steady dark eyes of a child who had already seen what was coming. "Sheriff us," Marlowe said. Her voice did not shake. "Bring the town." The first truck came up the drive at 4 in the afternoon. It was an old red pickup with a snowplow on the front, and Harlan Cooper was at the wheel. He was 72 years old, and he had owned the grocery store on the corner of Main and Elm for 46 of those years. And his wife had been alive when he started it, and dead for 9 years now. And he had not been to a wedding or a funeral or a town meeting in those 9 years without thinking of her. He parked his truck at an angle across the bottom of the drive. He got out, and he opened the toolbox in the bed, and he took out a shotgun in a canvas case. He carried it up the steps of the manor, and he set it on the porch, and he knocked on the door. When Marlowe opened it, he took off his cap. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "my wife had cancer in 2003. 3 rounds of treatment. We didn't have insurance for any of it. One day in the spring, a man from the hospital came down to the store, and he told me the whole bill had been paid. Anonymous. To this day, the only person who knew was your great-aunt Cordelia." He looked past her into the foyer. "You tell me where you want me, ma'am." The second truck came 20 minutes later. Then a sedan. Then a station wagon. Then 2 more trucks. Then a van with a plumber's logo on the side. Then an old Buick driven by a woman in her 70s with a sleeping pug in her lap. By dusk, there were 19 men on the grounds of Ravenwood Manor. Most of them were over 60. All of them remembered Cordelia. Some of them remembered Edmund. 2 of them had been at the wedding when Tobias Whitaker married Genevieve Ravenwood in a courthouse in Pittsburgh in the spring of 1987, because they had driven down to be witnesses when no one from the bride's family would come. They did not bring rifles. Bo Hendricks had been very clear about that on the phone. They brought shotguns and hunting knives and old service revolvers from the wars they had come home from, and a few of them brought baseball bats. They brought thermoses of coffee and packages of sandwiches their wives had wrapped in wax paper. They brought folding chairs. They brought in the case of Harlan Cooper, a small framed photograph of his late wife, which he placed on the dashboard of his truck before he climbed back out into the snow. Sheriff Beauregard Hendricks arrived at 6. He brought 2 deputies and a county prosecutor named Margaret Klein, a sharp-eyed woman of about 50, who set up a small recording device in the kitchen and tested it twice and put fresh batteries in it before she spoke. He brought a warrant for the arrest of Royce Blackwood on suspicion of stalking, harassment, and conspiracy. He brought in his inside pocket a copy of Edmund Ravenwood's missing will sealed inside an evidence bag. He stood on the porch of the manor at 6:30, with the snow beginning to fall again behind him, and he looked out over the men gathered on the lawn, and he did not raise his voice when he spoke to them. "Gentlemen," he said, "tonight is not a movie. Tonight is not a war. Tonight is a woman and a child in a house and a bad man on his way to take what is not his. You will follow my orders. You will not fire your weapons unless I tell you to. And when the storm breaks, you will be the wall between him and her. Is that understood?" It was understood. The storm broke at 8. It came in off Lake Champlain, the way the worst Vermont storms always do, with wind that bent the oaks and snow that fell sideways and a deep low howl in the eaves that made the old house creak like a ship. The power went out at 8:47. The phone lines went down at 9:15. By 10, every cell signal in the valley was dead. Marlowe was in Wren's bedroom. She had built a small nest of blankets on the floor between the bed and the wall, because the bed was too high and too exposed, and she wanted her daughter close to the ground. Wren was lying in the nest with the porcelain doll under her arm. She was not asleep. She was watching her mother by the light of a single candle in a glass jar. "Mama," Wren whispered. "Yes, baby." "The lady with the white hair is here." Marlowe looked at her daughter. She did not ask where. She did not ask what the lady was doing. She had learned in the last 2 weeks to take her daughter's words and lay them down carefully, the way you would lay down a thin sheet of glass. "What is she saying, sweetheart?" Wren looked toward the door of the bedroom. She was quiet for a long moment. "She says they're coming up the back. She says the kitchen door." Marlowe stood up. She crossed the room, and she opened the bedroom door, and she stepped out into the hallway. The candle in her hand cast a small moving pool of light on the wallpaper. She walked to the head of the staircase. She looked down. In the foyer below, Adelaide Holloway sat in a high-backed chair facing the front door. She was knitting. She was by any visible measure perfectly calm, but her left hand, the one not holding the needles, was resting on top of an old service revolver on the small table beside her chair. She looked up at Marlowe at the top of the stairs. She nodded once. Marlowe went down 2 steps. She caught Bo Hendricks's eye through the open door of the front parlor, where he was standing with Silas Ashford and two of the deputies. "The kitchen door," she said quietly. "She says they're coming the back way." Bo Hendricks looked at her for one long moment. He did not ask how she knew. He turned to one of his deputies and he said one word, and the deputy went. The sound came less than a minute later. The soft, careful splinter of wood at the kitchen door. A man's voice muffled swearing. Then the deeper, harder voice of Sheriff Hendricks calling out a name and a warrant number, and the sudden, shocked silence of men who had thought they were being clever. Two of them gave up at the kitchen door. The third one ran. He came up the back stairs. Marlowe heard his boots on the wood. She turned and she ran because Wren was not in the front parlor, and not in the kitchen, and not behind Adelaide Holloway with her revolver. Wren was upstairs. Marlowe reached the bedroom door 3 seconds before the man did. She slammed it shut. She turned the old iron key in the lock. She pressed her back against the door and her hand against her mouth, and she did not breathe. The man hit the door once, hard. The wood shuddered, but the lock held. He hit it again. "Wren," Marlowe whispered. "Wren, sweetheart, the closet. Get in the closet now." But Wren was not in the nest of blankets anymore. Wren was standing at the foot of her bed in her white nightgown with the porcelain doll held in front of her like a shield. She was looking at the door, and she was looking past her mother at something on the door that Marlowe could not see, and her face was very still and very pale and very brave. "Mama," she said, "there's another door." She pointed. At the back of the room, between the closet and the window, was a section of wall papered in the same small blue flowers as the rest of the bedroom. But the pattern very slightly did not match. The man hit the door a third time. Wood cracked around the lock. Marlowe crossed the room in 2 steps. She pressed her palm against the wallpaper. The wall gave. A small panel clicked. A door no taller than her daughter swung inward into darkness, and a draft of cold, dry air came out. And Marlowe seized her daughter and pushed her through the opening and crawled in after her. And she pulled the door closed behind them, just as the lock on the bedroom door gave way, and a man's heavy boots crossed the floorboards. Inside the wall, the passage was narrow. Marlowe crawled. Wren crawled ahead of her, one small hand outstretched, feeling her way. The passage turned. It turned again. It descended. And then it opened, and Marlowe lifted herself through, and she found that she was kneeling on the dusty floor of Cordelia Ravenwood's hidden study, the one off the foyer, the one with the wingback chair and the photograph of Genevieve. Wren was already at the desk. She was very calm. She climbed up into the wingback chair. She held the porcelain doll in her lap. She looked at her mother in the half-darkness with only the moonlight from the cracked curtain to see by, and she said very quietly, "Mama, the lady with the white hair says we have to be quiet now. She says the sheriff is coming." Above them, the house had begun to move. Boots on the staircase, shouting. The crash of something heavy in the front parlor. Marlowe pressed her back against the hidden door and held her daughter against her chest, and she could feel the small, fast rhythm of Wren's heart, and her own slower, harder one, and she could not tell where one of them ended and the other began. The shouting came closer. A door at the end of a hall slammed open. A voice she had not yet heard up close but that she knew said, "They are in this house, gentlemen. Find them." Royce Blackwood. He was inside her home. He was inside her grandfather's home 57 autumns after his father had murdered the man who built it, and he was hunting her daughter. Marlowe felt something rise inside her that she had not felt in 3 weeks on a park bench. Something she had not felt in 2 years since Calder had walked out the door. Something she had not perhaps ever felt in her life before this night. She handed the porcelain doll back to her daughter. She picked up the iron poker that Cordelia had left 57 autumns ago leaning against the small fireplace in her hidden study. She kissed her daughter once on the top of her head. "Stay here," she whispered. "Do not come out. Do not make a sound. The lady with the white hair will tell you when it's safe." Wren nodded. Marlowe stood up. She opened the small hidden door into the foyer. Royce Blackwood was standing at the foot of the grand staircase with his back to her, a pistol in his right hand. He was very tall. In her memory afterward, Marlowe would always remember that he had seemed very tall. She crossed the marble floor on bare feet. The poker was heavy in her hand. She did not run. She did not call out. She walked toward the man who had come to take her daughter, and she lifted the poker, and at the last possible moment he heard her. and he turned, and his face went through 3 expressions in less than 1 second. Surprise, recognition, fury. He raised the pistol, Eeka. And Silas Ashford, who had come down the back hallway behind him with a brass lamp in his hands, hit Royce Blackwood across the back of the skull with everything a 55-year-old historian had to give. The pistol fired into the ceiling. Plaster rained down. Royce went to one knee and then to both knees, and then he fell on his face on the foyer floor and did not move. Sheriff Beauregard Hendricks came down the staircase 3 steps at a time with his sidearm drawn, and behind him came 2 of his deputies, and behind them came Adelaide Holloway, who had not put down her knitting and was holding the revolver at her side as though she had forgotten she was carrying it. Beau Hendricks did not look at the man on the floor. He looked at Marlowe. "Mrs. Whitaker, my daughter is in the room." He nodded once. He turned to one of his deputies. "Cuff him. If he so much as breathes wrong, you tell me." He turned back to Marlowe. "Show me the child." Marlowe walked to the hidden door. She knelt. She opened it. Wren was sitting in the wingback chair with the porcelain doll on her lap in the dark. She looked up. Her eyes were very large and very calm. "Mama," she said, "is the bad man asleep now?" Marlowe could not speak. She reached out both arms. The recording on the small device in the kitchen, the one that Margaret Klein had so carefully tested at 6 o'clock that evening, captured the next 90 seconds in clean, undistorted audio. It captured the sound of Royce Blackwood waking up on the marble floor of Ravenwood Manor with steel around his wrists. It captured the sound of Sheriff Beauregard Hendricks reading him his rights. It captured Royce's voice, ragged and furious and unguarded, snarling that this house belonged to his family, that his father had earned it, that the old man Edmund Ravenwood had stepped onto that boat on his own 2 feet and had died because he had been too proud to take a fair offer, that the girl Genevieve had been a complication that was handled by a nurse who knew her business, and that Marlowe Whitaker was a homeless beggar who had no right to anything she had walked into. The recording captured all of it. It captured also the sound of Marlowe Whitaker kneeling on the floor of the foyer with her 6-year-old daughter in her arms, saying nothing at all. The county prosecutor would later say that in 26 years of practice, she had never been handed a confession quite so complete by quite so foolish a man. They took Royce Blackwood out of the manor in handcuffs at 11:22 on the night of the storm. 2 deputies drove him into town. By morning, he was in a cell in the county jail. By the end of the week, federal investigators had begun taking apart Blackwood development document by document, contract by contract, going back 40 years. Marlowe slept that night in the 4-poster bed in the master bedroom, with Wren curled against her side and the porcelain doll tucked under the child's arm. The storm went on until dawn. When she woke, the sun was on the snow, and the world outside the window was so white and so clean that she had to close her eyes against it. Silas Ashford came at 9 with coffee and a tin of biscuits his sister had baked. Beau Hendricks came at 10 with the official paperwork. Dr. Pembroke came at 11 to check on Wren because he said an 80-year-old country doctor did not retire from a child like that. Adelaide Holloway, who had spent the night in the kitchen knitting, simply made breakfast. By noon, the manor was full of people again. The same trucks, the same men, the same wives who had wrapped sandwiches the night before were now setting out covered dishes in the dining room, the way they would have for a wake or a wedding. Except no one had died and no one was getting married. It was something older than either of those things. It was a town deciding that one of its own had come home. Marlowe was standing in the hidden study late that afternoon when she found the letter. It had been tucked behind a leather volume of poetry on the second shelf of the bookcase. She would not have seen it except that her daughter had walked into the room ahead of her and gone directly to the shelf and pulled the volume out and held it up. "Mama," Wren said, "there's a letter for you." The envelope was thick and cream-colored and carried in the same elegant hand that had recorded her birth in the family Bible the words to Marlowe. "When the time comes." She sat down in the wingback chair. She opened the envelope. She read, "My dear grandniece, if you are reading this, then events have unfolded as I foresaw. And you have come home, and you have brought with you the small soul I have known about since long before she was born. I have a great deal to tell you, and a small amount of paper to tell it on, so I will be plain. Your mother did not die of natural causes. I believe in my heart that she was killed by a nurse placed in our hospital by Garrison Blackwood. I could never prove it. I would not have been believed. The county was theirs in that year. So I made another choice. I gave you up. I gave you to a good family in Connecticut, a family I had researched for 2 years before I let you go. I followed your life from a distance. The anonymous scholarship that paid for your college, the trust that paid down your mother's mortgage in 1996, the small grant that helped you adopt a kitten in the 3rd grade, although that one, I confess, was entirely indulgent of me. I watched you, and I let you grow up safe, far from the people who would have used you to control what was left of our family. While you were growing up, I was working. For 37 years, I have been quietly, patiently, methodically buying back what Garrison Blackwood stole. Shell company by shell company, share by share. By the time you are reading this, you are the controlling shareholder of Ravenwood Industries, although the world does not yet know it. The mineral rights to this land, which is what they have always wanted, are protected by your grandfather's will for the next 63 years. And the trust that protects them is iron. The money in the trust I have left for you is more than sufficient. You will never have to sit on a park bench again, my darling. You will never have to count the coins at the bottom of a purse. Use it well. There is one more thing I must tell you, and it is the thing I have most wanted to say. I knew about Wren long before you knew about her. I knew her in dreams. I knew her on long winter evenings in this very chair, when I was old and alone and very tired. And a small voice in my head, which I knew was not entirely my own, would tell me that the line was not broken, that the next Ravenwood woman was coming, and that she would be the strongest of any of us. She has the gift, my darling, the gift that runs in the women of this family. Protect her, teach her. Do not be frightened of what she knows. And one last thing which I confess I'm not proud of, but which I do not regret. The man named Silas Ashford is the grandson of your father, Tobias Whitaker's closest friend. His grandfather drove Tobias and Genevieve to the courthouse in Pittsburgh in 1987. I have known the Ashford family for 60 years. 3 years ago, I quietly endowed the position of director at the Ashford Hollow Historical Society in order to bring Silas home from a teaching post in Boston, where he had been since his wife died. I did not matchmake. I would not insult you with that. I simply made sure that when you came home, there would be a good man in this town who already knew your story and who would help you carry it. He does not know any of this. I leave it to you whether you tell him. I have run out of paper. I have not run out of love. I have loved you for 37 years, my dear, even though I never held you. I have loved your daughter for the entire small life that she has lived. Even though I never saw her, I will love both of you in whatever form love takes after it leaves a body, for as long as there are Ravenwood women in this house. Be brave, be kind. Take care of Adelaide. She's the bravest of us all. Your loving great-aunt Cordelia Ravenwood. Marlowe sat in the chair for a long time. The afternoon light moved slowly across the floor of the small room. Wren climbed up into her lap and rested her dark head against her mother's shoulder, and did not ask what the letter said. After a while, Marlowe folded the letter and put it back in its envelope and slid the envelope into the pocket of her sweater. She did not tell Silas Ashford. She decided, sitting in the chair with the warm weight of her daughter against her, that some bonds are stronger when they grow on their own without being told what they are. Some bonds simply are. 6 months later, the brass plaque on the gate of Ravenwood Manor was replaced. The new plaque was simple dark bronze engraved in plain block letters. It read, Ravenwood Sanctuary for Mothers and Children, Estate 2025. The east wing had been refitted into small private apartments, 6 of them each with a bedroom and a bathroom, and a small kitchen, each large enough to comfortably hold a mother and a child or 2. The first 3 were occupied within a month of opening. By the end of the summer, all 6 were full, with a quiet, careful waiting list managed by Adelaide Holloway, who had been formally named the Director of Operations, and who took her duties with exactly the gravity they deserved. The West Wing held a small museum of the family's history, which Silas Ashford had helped Marlowe design. It held the original blueprints of the manor. It held the letters that Tobias Whitaker had written to Genevieve Ravenwood in the summer of 1965. It held Edmund's will framed and sealed under glass. It did not hold the journal. The journal lived in a locked drawer in the desk of the hidden study because some things are not for visitors. The lower floor of the West Wing held a small one-room schoolhouse where a retired teacher named Imogen Sullivan, who was 71 years old and had been a friend of Cordelia's, taught the children of the sanctuary their letters and their numbers in the mornings and read them stories in the afternoons. Wren had become her star pupil. She had also become the unofficial guide for any new child who arrived at the sanctuary, leading them by the hand through the rooms of the old house and explaining gravely and patiently where the kitchen was, and which doors made the loudest noises, and where the best window was for watching the snow. Royce Blackwood was sentenced in the fall after a trial that lasted 3 weeks and drew reporters from Boston and New York. He was convicted of kidnapping, conspiracy, and accessory after the fact in the matter of the death of Edmund Ravenwood, on the basis of his own confession, which the jury listened to 3 times. He went to a federal prison in upstate New York for a very long time. The Blackwood family fortune, what was left of it after the federal investigation, was distributed in restitution to the families the Blackwoods had cheated over 4 decades. There were many of them. Sheriff Beauregard Hendricks retired the following spring. He was 66 years old. He had been the sheriff of Ashford County for 32 years. At his retirement dinner in the back room of Maribel's diner, he stood up to give a short speech, and he could not get through it. And he sat back down, and Adelaide Holloway reached over and patted his hand without looking at him. He came up to the manor every Sunday after that for supper. Wren called him Grandpa Beau within a month. He did not correct her. Silas Ashford came on Tuesdays and Thursdays for tea. He brought books for Wren. He never overstayed. He never asked Marlowe for anything she had not yet decided to give. They became slowly the kind of friends who could sit in silence in the same room for an hour and who did not need to fill it. On a Sunday evening in late October, almost a year after she had stepped off a bus into the snow, Marlowe stood in the hidden study with her daughter beside her, and she looked at the 3 portraits on the wall. On the left, Genevieve Ravenwood painted from the photograph in the silver frame, smiling 22 years old, with her head tilted slightly to the right. In the middle, Cordelia Ravenwood painted from a photograph Adelaide had given the artist, white-haired, sharp-eyed, with the small dry smile of a woman who had outlived her enemies. On the right, painted the previous month from life Marlowe Whitaker, with Wren in her lap. Wren reached up and touched the painting of Cordelia very gently. "Mama," she said. The lady with the white hair went away. Marlowe knelt down beside her daughter. "Did she, sweetheart? She said she didn't need to come anymore. She said the house is ours now. She said she could rest." Marlowe looked at her daughter for a long moment. The little girl was looking up at the portrait with calm, dark, ancient eyes. Outside the small window, the wind moved through the oaks. The old house creaked the way old houses do, settling on its bones. Somewhere downstairs in the kitchen, Adelaide Holloway was putting a kettle on the stove. Somewhere in the east wing, a baby was crying, and a young mother was singing it back to sleep. Marlowe gathered her daughter into her arms. She looked at the 3 faces of 3 Ravenwood women on the wall, and she thought of a 4th one on a park bench in Brooklyn at 2 in the morning, who had not in that moment known that any of this was waiting for her. She thought of the cold that had been in her bones, and of the $47 in her wallet, and of the small breath of a sleeping child against her neck. "Yes, baby," she whispered into her daughter's hair. "We are home. We are finally home."